What happens when 42 men are swallowed by the sea, yet no storm is recorded, no wreckage ever found, and no bodies ever washed ashore? In the year 1714, whispers began along a jagged coastline, whispers that spoke of a pirate captain who did not just kill, but erased. His name was etched in fear, his crimes unspoken. And then, one night, he and every soul he held captive vanished, as though the earth itself had conspired to hide them. Why was this story buried? Why were witnesses silenced? And what truth lies beneath a history that refuses to be told? The Ozarks, in the aftermath of the Civil War, were not the rolling, picturesque highlands romanticized in later decades, but a harsh, unsettled frontier caught between recovery and ruin. In 1867, the ridges rose like walls of shadow, their forests, dense and unbroken, swallowing sound in a silence that was more suffocating than peaceful. The air smelled of damp pine and decaying leaves, the ground often slick from sudden rains that carved gullies into wagon roads. Travelers who entered these hills rarely did so lightly. Every creak of a wagon wheel, every rustle in the underbrush carried a reminder that this land, though breathtaking, was far from safe. The war had officially ended 2 years earlier, but its scars were everywhere. Missouri had been a battleground state, divided in loyalty, and the Ozarks bore the weight of that division. Burned-out farmhouses dotted the valleys. Entire families had fled, leaving their land to the wilderness. Men who once wore uniforms, Union blue or Confederate gray, now roamed the hills with no master but hunger. The word bushwhacker became more than a label. It was a living terror, describing men who ambushed travelers for their meager possessions, men hardened by years of killing who had no desire to return to the plow. It was into this fragile, almost lawless environment that the cold case of the brothers began to form. Before their tavern was built, the area around their land was already whispered about. The road itself, a twisting, rutted trail threading through the ridges, had a reputation for swallowing people. Merchants spoke of delays, of companions who vanished between one bend and the next. Letters sent from St. Louis to Springfield went undelivered, lost not to the incompetence of postal riders but to something darker, something that fed on the isolation of the Ozarks. The brothers did not invent that fear, but they stepped into it, shaping it, turning it to their advantage. Life. In 1867, Missouri was marked by uncertainty. Few families trusted their neighbors, and the constant turnover of settlers moving west meant strangers passed through daily. For the weary traveler, a tavern represented safety, warmth, a bed, a meal, and the reassurance of human contact after days on unforgiving trails. The brothers understood this deeply. They cultivated an image of modest hospitality. Their establishment was not grand, a crude log structure with a chimney that coughed smoke into the treetops, a lean-to stable, a wooden sign that swayed in the wind. Yet it drew people in, because in the Ozarks, even the roughest tavern was better than the uncertainty of another night in the open. What made their presence so unsettling was not the tavern itself, but the atmosphere it created. Survivors who passed through described the interior as oppressively quiet. Taverns were supposed to hum with life, clinking cups, laughter, arguments, the shuffle of boots on a dirt floor. But here, conversation seemed strangled. The brothers kept to themselves, speaking only when necessary, their eyes flicking between guests as if measuring them. The food was passable, the drink strong, but there was something in the air that left visitors uneasy, like stepping into a church desecrated. For purposes it was never meant to serve. The larger context of 1867 adds another layer to this unease. Reconstruction politics gripped Missouri. Lawmen were underpaid, poorly equipped, and often too entangled in local disputes to act with impartiality. In rural regions like the Ozarks, a sheriff might cover miles of territory, his authority extending only as far as the loyalty of the men who supported him. Justice was selective, and the disappearance of a few travelers, especially outsiders with no kin nearby, was not enough to stir an official investigation. This vacuum allowed the brothers to thrive. Each missing person became another ghost, swallowed by the hills, their absence chalked up to bandits, wild animals, or simply bad luck. But the pattern did not go unnoticed. Local farmers whispered of strange sights, wagons left standing by the roadside, horses wandering without riders, shallow mounds of earth that appeared after heavy rains. Some swore they heard cries in the night, carried down the hollows by the wind, though when they approached the tavern at dawn, the brothers greeted them with calm, unblinking faces. The contradictions gnawed at the community. Were these men simply unlucky innkeepers falsely accused by circumstance? Or were they architects of something grim, using the isolation of the Ozarks as their cloak? The year 1867 sharpened these questions because of the transient nature of the population. The great westward migration was in full swing, families packed, wagons with all they owned, chasing promises of fertile land in Kansas, Oklahoma, or beyond. To them, Missouri was a corridor, a place to be crossed rather than settled. Few of these travelers knew the land well, and fewer still had allies to vouch for them if they disappeared. The brothers' tavern sat like a snare along this migration path, ready to catch the desperate and the weary. Every traveler who stopped there carried not just possessions but trust that they would wake the next morning to continue their journey. That trust, in too many cases, proved fatal. Though details remain murky, the essence of the cold case rests on one fact. People vanished, and the tavern was often their last known stop. The stories differ. Some say poison was slipped into drinks, others claim knives in the dark. Still others whisper of rituals carried out under moonlight, the bodies fed to the earth itself. None of these tales could be verified, but all shared the same chilling core. The brothers served more than water, and what they offered was never meant to sustain life. The geography of the Ozarks magnified the terror. The land was a labyrinth of valleys and ridges, caves and sinkholes, streams that disappeared underground for miles before resurfacing. A body could vanish here as easily as a candle flame in the wind. Those who searched often returned empty-handed, their resolve broken by the sheer vastness of the terrain. The brothers knew this, and if indeed they were guilty, they wielded the land itself as their accomplice. When outsiders finally pressed for answers, merchants demanding to know why their associates had not arrived, families writing letters begging for news, the official responses were vague. The road is dangerous. Accidents happen. The wilderness claims many. Each explanation was plausible, but each avoided the truth locals dared not speak aloud. To accuse the brothers directly was to risk drawing their attention, and in a region where law had no teeth, such an accusation might be a death sentence in itself. Thus the legend began to take root, fed by fear, silence, and rumor. By the time the case was whispered beyond the Ozarks, it had already hardened into myth. Travelers who passed through were told not to linger near that stretch of road, not to drink from cups offered too freely, not to trust smiles that came without warmth. Yet still the tavern stood, its chimney puffing smoke, its doors opening and closing, swallowing one guest after another. In 1867 Missouri, the line between survival and predation was thin. Hunger, desperation, and lawlessness bred men who would do anything to secure their place in a collapsing world. The brothers embodied this tension. Whether they were murderers, opportunists, or something darker, they became symbols of a time when the Ozarks themselves seemed to conspire against the living. Their tavern was no longer merely a waypoint on the road. It was a shadow, a wound in the land, a reminder that in those years, the price of a drink might well be your life. The year was 1714, and the Carolina coast stretched like a scar against the edge of the New World, a place both promising and cursed. To the settlers who clung to its sandy shores, the land offered timber, trade, and survival. To the sailors who traced its ragged outline, it offered something else entirely: danger. Here the sea was shallow in strange ways, filled with shoals that seemed to move like living things, swallowing vessels whole without warning. The waters reflected the mood of the age, uncertain, shifting, treacherous. And just as the sea could betray its own, so too could men. This was the era when the black flag carried more weight than the law, and when whispers of pirates could empty a harbor before dawn. It was in this turbulent year that the story of the vanished captain began, though few dared to tell it openly. Official records from the colonies give us little, almost nothing about what truly happened, and that silence itself is haunting. But fragments remain in letters, journals, and the spoken recollections passed through generations. Together, they draw the outline of a mystery that resists clarity, a void in time where men and memory disappeared. The silence is not just historical neglect, it feels deliberate, like someone had reason to bury what really happened. The Carolina coast was no stranger to piracy. Its geography, with hidden inlets and marshlands, made it the perfect refuge for men who lived outside the law. These pirates were not mere brigands, they were tacticians of fear. They sailed under false flags until they were close enough to strike, and when the black flag was raised, it was already too late. Colonial governors issued warnings, but their words carried little weight, for many of these same officials secretly benefited from piracy's spoils. Smuggling, bribery, and political compromise blurred the line between outlaw and authority. Against this backdrop, one pirate captain emerged, feared not only for his cunning, but for the aura that surrounded him. His name is missing from the record, erased as though it never existed. But that absence itself speaks volumes. Pirates of lesser infamy had their names scrawled across trials, sermons, and broadsides warning of their deeds. Yet here, with this man, there is only silence. Some letters refer to him in vague titles: the Revenant, the Pale Captain, the Man Who Walks Again. None of these may have been his true name, but they capture the fear he inspired. To his enemies he was more than flesh and blood. He was inevitability, a shadow that appeared on the horizon and could not be escaped. It was during one raid in 1714 that he captured not just plunder, but people. 42 prisoners were taken alive, bound, and kept aboard his ship. These were not random men. Some were merchants, yes, but others appear to have been government men, perhaps informants or spies. That number, 42, would take on a cursed weight in later retellings, as though the sheer size of the group made their fate even more impossible to explain. Prisoners could be ransomed or sold, and pirates rarely wasted such assets. And yet, with these men, something different occurred. Witnesses along the coast reported sighting the ship as it sailed north. Some described its sails as torn, others claimed they shone white against the dusk as though catching a light unseen by others. And then, after those sightings, nothing. No wreckage, no driftwood, no corpses washing ashore, no rumors of sale or ransom. 42 men and the captain himself vanished in one stroke. Not even a storm is recorded in the shipping logs of that week. This is where the story darkens. Colonial officials, instead of demanding answers, seemed almost relieved. Letters between governors make only passing reference to troublesome matters now resolved. Traders who had lost kin among the captives were told to stop asking questions. It was not just an event forgotten, it was an event erased. The lack of outrage is telling. Pirates who killed far fewer men were hunted down, tried, and executed publicly. Yet here, when 42 lives vanished, silence. Theories sprouted like weeds in the absence of truth. Some believed the captain's crew turned on him, killing him and the prisoners in a mutiny that was never confessed. Others swore that the prisoners themselves staged an uprising, spilling blood and fleeing into the wilderness of Carolina, where they either blended into settlements or died unknown deaths. But if that were the case, why did no survivor ever come forward? Why did not even one voice tell the tale of what happened aboard that ship? The silence was too perfect, too complete. There were those who whispered of storms unrecorded, sudden, maelstroms conjured not by weather but by something unnatural. Fishermen told of seeing strange lights offshore, lanterns that swayed in rhythm like a procession, before vanishing into mist. To speak of these things too loudly was dangerous. Men laughed at the tales, but their laughter was nervous, forced. They laughed so they would not tremble. And beneath these rumors lay the suspicion that the colonial governors themselves may have known more than they admitted. If those 42 men were indeed spies or informants, perhaps their disappearance served someone's interest. Perhaps the pirate captain was not just an outlaw, but an agent working in shadows too deep for the average settler to see. In that sense, the vanishing was not a tragedy, but a message. Some men were never meant to return. Time eroded the sharp edges of the tale. By the mid-18th century, it had already shifted into folklore. Children were warned not to stray too close to the waves at night, lest the revenant captain take them aboard his ghostly ship. The number 42 was avoided, considered unlucky. And in the darkest hours, sailors swore they could hear cries on the wind, like men calling for help from beneath the waves. The legend became part of the coastline itself, sewn into the fabric of place and memory. Yet even now, looking back, the details gnaw at us. Why was the captain's name erased when even Blackbeard and lesser marauders were remembered? Why did officials allow the matter to die when they should have used it to strike fear into other pirates? And why, after more than 3 centuries, does the fate of 42 souls remain hidden beneath layers of silence? The Carolina coast holds many secrets, but few are as disturbing as this one. It is not just the disappearance itself that unsettles. It is the effort to bury it. History, after all, remembers what it chooses, and what it chooses not to remember often speaks loudest of all. The void left behind by that year, by that captain, by those prisoners, is a shadow cast across time, reminding us that the past is not just what happened, but also what was erased. The story of the 42 prisoners taken in 1714 is not merely a detail of the pirate captain's cruelty. It is the axis on which the entire mystery turns. For in that age, prisoners were currency. Pirates ransomed wealthy merchants, impressed sailors into their ranks, or sold captives into slavery. Every man taken alive had value, and no captain squandered such assets lightly. Yet here we are, faced with a haunting question. How could 42 human beings vanish so completely, as, though swallowed by something deeper than the sea? The scale of their disappearance makes it impossible to dismiss as chance. 42 voices, each with kin, colleagues, or communities who expected them to return, were silenced at once. Who were they? Surviving fragments point to a diverse group, not merely unlucky sailors plucked from the decks of a merchant vessel. Among them were merchants whose ties extended back to London's powerful trading houses, men whose wealth and influence would not go unnoticed if they vanished. Others were ordinary sailors, hardened by years at sea, accustomed to danger, but never prepared for what awaited them. And then there were the shadows within the group, 2 or perhaps 3 believed to be agents of the crown, informants sent to infiltrate pirate crews or monitor illicit trade. If that was true, their presence changed everything. They were not just captives. They were secrets waiting to be uncovered. Life as a prisoner aboard a pirate ship was both brutal and uncertain. Shackled below deck, the air thick with salt, tar, and human sweat, the men would have felt the creaking of the timbers as the vessel cut through shallow waters. Food, if provided, would have been little more than hardtack and brackish water, the bare minimum to keep them alive. Darkness pressed on them, broken only by the light of a swinging lantern that threw distorted shadows across their faces. Conversations would have been hushed, fearful. Did they whisper plans of escape? Did they try to bargain with their captors? Or did they sit in silence, resigned to the fate that seemed inevitable under the black flag? Yet these prisoners were not cargo to be neglected. The captain had purpose in taking them, or so the surviving accounts suggest. A captured sailor, whose testimony decades later was recorded secondhand, claimed that the pirate captain interrogated some of the men. He asked about troop movements, shipping routes, even rumors of conflict stirring inland. Why would a pirate care about such things? Unless, of course, he was more than a marauder. Unless his ship was not only a predator of commerce, but a vessel of intelligence. Collecting knowledge as valuable as gold. The fate of the prisoners grows more chilling when we examine what did not happen. No ransom letters were sent to governors or families. No records exist of their sale in the slave markets of the Caribbean. No escaped captive ever surfaced to tell the tale. Silence replaced every possible outcome, a silence that feels constructed. For in the chaos of the early 18th century, when pirates and colonial authorities clashed constantly, there was always noise, rumors, reports, gossip in taverns. But in this case, the noise was cut short. Smothered folklore filled the vacuum where facts should have been. Some stories told of the prisoners rising against the captain, slitting throats in the dark and seizing the vessel, only to be driven mad by the sea and lost forever. Others claimed the men were sacrificed, offered in a ritual to dark forces the captain served. Fishermen whispered that on moonless nights they could hear faint cries drifting across the waves, the echoes of men who had drowned but not found. Peace. And among sailors, the number 42 became a curse. Superstition warned that ships with that number of crew or passengers would not return. If the men staged an uprising, why did none survive to claim victory? If they were executed, where are the bodies, the wreckage, the signs of slaughter? If the sea took them, why did no debris wash ashore, as it always does after a wreck? Each explanation unravels the moment it is tested, leaving only the raw fact of their disappearance. That is what makes the story so compelling. 42 men could not vanish in ordinary ways. Something extraordinary happened, and that something was carefully hidden. The most unsettling possibility is that their disappearance was not the work of pirates alone. If the group truly included informants or spies, then their erasure may have been convenient for the colonial governors as well. Official records of piracy in Carolina during 1714 are sparse to the point of suspicious. Weeks vanish from the archives, as though pages were deliberately removed. If the prisoners carried knowledge that threatened not just the pirates, but also the officials who profited from piracy's shadow economy, then the silence becomes understandable. Perhaps they were executed not to satisfy bloodlust, but to erase inconvenient witnesses. In this theory, the pirate captain becomes less of a villain and more of a tool, an instrument wielded by unseen hands. Families of the prisoners searched for answers, but they found only doors closed against them. Letters of inquiry sent to governors were returned unanswered. Some who pressed too hard reportedly disappeared themselves, their names slipping into the same fog that swallowed their kin. This pattern of intimidation suggests more than negligence. It suggests complicity. To silence 42 families requires more than apathy. It requires a decision, a coordinated effort to let absence speak louder than truth. And so the fate of the prisoners became legend, reshaped by fear and retold in the language of nightmares. Children along the coast were warned that if they misbehaved, the ghostly pirates would take them away, just as they had taken the 42. Sailors spoke of cursed voices carried by the wind, calling for help from beneath the waves. In some communities it was said that if one repeated the number 42 aloud before a voyage, the sea itself would claim the ship. These stories may sound like superstition, but they are the scars of memory. The only way a community could preserve what it was forbidden to speak openly. What lingers is the sense of deliberate erasure, the human void left in place of 42 distinct lives. Each man had a story, a family, a reason for being on that vessel. And yet history reduced them to a single number, a statistic swallowed by silence. It is easier to speak of 42 prisoners than to acknowledge the weight of 42, individuals who breathed, feared, and hoped. Their reduction to a number mirrors their reduction in records. Faceless, nameless, erased. That erasure is itself the greatest crime. In the end, the prisoners are not remembered for who they were, but for what they became, a symbol of absence, a warning etched into the Carolina coast. They embody the fragility of human memory, the ease with which lives can be swallowed when it suits power to forget. Their vanishing was not just an event of the sea, but an act of history itself, choosing what to remember and what to bury. And in that choice, the 42 prisoners remained trapped forever, neither alive in story nor dead in fact, suspended in the uneasy silence that is their true legacy. The vanishing itself is what transforms the story of the pirate captain and his captives from a grim episode of violence into one of the most haunting mysteries of the early 18th century. Disappearances at sea were not unusual. Storms, hidden shoals, and sudden mutinies could erase ships from the horizon within hours. But those events always left traces: splintered wood washing up on beaches, barrels of cargo bobbing in the surf, survivors clinging to driftwood, or rumors carried by escaped crew. In this case, there was nothing. A ship that had been sighted by multiple witnesses one week was simply gone the next, and the silence that followed felt unnatural. No storm was logged in the shipping journals, no naval records mention a chase, no privateer claimed the bounty of its capture. 42 prisoners and the captain who held them slipped into absence so complete that it unsettled even the hardened men of the coast. Those who lived along the Carolina shores began to whisper of it in taverns and marketplaces. A fisherman swore he had seen the pirate ship's lanterns burning faintly offshore the night before the disappearance, lined up in strange formation as though guided by something unseen. Another spoke of hearing cries carried over the waves, the voices of men shouting for help before falling silent. These accounts were never entered into official record, dismissed as drunken fantasy or the tricks of the wind, yet they endured, because they filled the void left by the unexplained. In an age where the sea was already feared as unpredictable and merciless, this sudden vanishing pressed on the imagination like a weight. It was not just that a ship was lost, it was that it was erased without cause. Theories grew like tangled vines around this absence. The most practical explanation was mutiny. The crew, perhaps weary of their captain's severity, might have risen against him, killing both him and the prisoners in one violent act. But mutiny leaves survivors, men eager to escape punishment or to boast of their triumph. No such men ever surfaced. Without testimony, the mutiny theory collapses into speculation. Another theory spoke of the prisoners themselves rising up, seizing the chance to overwhelm their captors. They could have turned the ship, tried to flee, and failed in waters too shallow and treacherous to forgive error. But again, if this were true, where was the wreckage? The flotsam that always floated to shore after disaster. The sea keeps few secrets, and yet here, it kept them all. More unsettling were the theories that stepped beyond the boundaries of reason. Some whispered that the captain had made a pact with something unearthly, and when the time came, the sea claimed not only him, but every soul aboard. Fishermen told of ghostly lights flickering far from land, of sails seen gliding silently under a moonless sky before dissolving into mist. Mothers warned their children that to walk the beach at night was to hear the voices of the 42 calling, luring them toward the waves. These tales may sound like superstition, yet in the absence of truth, they took on the weight of belief. In coastal villages where the line between life and death was as thin as the tide, superstition carried its own authority. The silence from colonial officials only deepened the sense of unease. Governors who normally seized upon any pirate's downfall as propaganda made no mention of the disappearance. No proclamations were issued, no sermons preached against the captain's wickedness. It was as though the event was inconvenient to acknowledge, an episode better left unspoken. Families who lost fathers, sons, or brothers among the prisoners sought answers and found none. Some letters of inquiry were returned unopened, others received only curt replies. No information can be given at this time. The wall of silence felt deliberate, coordinated, as though officials feared not the pirates, but the truth of what had transpired. Whispers of conspiracy spread. Some suggested the captain had been in league with colonial powers, striking deals, in secret, perhaps even acting as an unofficial agent against rival empires. If the prisoners included spies or informants who knew too much, their disappearance might have served the interests of both pirate and governor alike. In such a scenario, the vanishing was not a tragedy, but an erasure, a way to tidy the loose threads of a story too dangerous to leave untangled. The lack of outrage, the missing records, the vanished names, all hint at a truth too dark to survive in daylight. Others believed the disappearance marked a turning point in the balance between order and chaos on the Carolina coast. In 1714, piracy was at its height, but its decline was approaching. The Crown would soon turn its attention to eradicating the Black Flag, hunting down captains with increasing ruthlessness. Perhaps the vanishing was part of that shift, a quiet purge carried out without trial or spectacle, leaving no evidence behind. To erase 42 prisoners along with the captain may have been brutal, but it was efficient. And efficiency, in the hands of men who feared scandal more than blood, often masqueraded as necessity. As decades passed, the event transformed into folklore. The number 42 became cursed, avoided by sailors when counting crew. Some captains refused to embark with 42 men aboard, insisting that one must be added or dismissed to break the omen. Along the coast, abandoned inlets were said to echo with the cries of the vanished prisoners, their voices carried on the wind during still nights. Children grew up with warnings not to follow ghostly lights on the water, for they belonged to the lost ship. These stories blurred the line between history and legend, but they also preserved the memory of an event that official records tried to erase. The vanishing stands as more than a maritime mystery. It is a rupture in the fabric of history, a place where facts end and silence begins. It is unsettling not simply because men died, but because their deaths, or disappearances, were hidden. Absence became the story, a hole large enough to swallow 42 souls and the man who commanded them. That hole remains, centuries later, a reminder that history is not only what is remembered, but what is made to be forgotten. The Carolina coast holds many tragedies, but few strike as deeply as this one. For in this case, the sea did not merely take, it concealed. And in its concealment it left behind a legacy of unease, a shadow that stretches across time, reminding us that not all mysteries of the past are meant to be solved, and that sometimes silence is the loudest voice of all. The sea has always been a graveyard of truths, and on the Carolina coast in 1714, it became a theater for one of the most chilling vanishing acts in colonial history. The record is deceptively thin, a passing mention in dispatches, a scribbled note in a sailor's diary, the barest acknowledgement of 42 men who were alive one week and gone the next. Yet when we examine the fragments, a pattern emerges, suggesting not just a disappearance, but a deliberate erasure. Witnesses spoke of a pirate captain whose name shifted depending on who told the tale. To some, he was a ruthless opportunist who had clawed his way to command by blood and betrayal. To others, he was a shadow of a more notorious figure, perhaps even a ghostly double meant to carry out deeds too dangerous for the infamous captains of the age. Whoever he was, he did not vanish alone. 42 prisoners, bound for trial, for ransom, for execution, slipped into the same void with him. Ships that sailed the same waters swore they saw nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, not even a splinter of driftwood. This silence was stranger than violence, for the sea usually confesses. Storms spit out their dead. Sharks drag remains toward shore. But here nothing returned, as if the ocean itself had been complicit in the disappearance, swallowing wood, iron, and flesh with surgical precision. Colonial authorities offered explanations that sounded more like excuses: mutiny, escape, storms. Yet no storm had been charted. Mutiny left no survivors to boast. Escape required a vessel, but no vessel was ever claimed. The void spoke louder than their words, and it forced people to ask, what kind of power could make 42 men and their captor dissolve into absence? The coastal settlements buzzed with rumor. Some swore the prisoners were never prisoners at all, but witnesses to something larger, something the authorities wanted, silenced. Others whispered of a pact. The captain had made a bargain with the sea, or with something older than the sea, to carry souls into darkness in exchange for safe passage elsewhere. Tales from enslaved Africans brought through the same waters hinted at spirits in the waves, ancestral forces that could take entire crews if angered. Fishermen muttered of lights dancing on the horizon the night the men vanished. Not lightning, not fire, but something colder, like lanterns beneath the surface. When pressed, they refused to say more, shaking their heads as if naming the thing might invite it ashore. What makes the case darker is how quickly it was buried. Trials that had been scheduled for the prisoners were struck from the docket with barely a word. Families of the men received no notice, only silence. The few letters that described the events vanished from archives within decades, leaving behind tantalizing references in footnotes but no primary testimony. It is as if the disappearance embarrassed the authorities, or worse, implicated them. Did the captain operate under a hidden charter? Was he carrying out a mission no one dared acknowledge publicly? To remove 42 men at once was not just violence, it was policy, enacted in shadows. And history has a habit of hiding policies that do not fit the myth of civilization. Those who look deeper into 1714 find connections. This was a year of transition, a year when privateers who had once been licensed by crowns were being cast off, transformed into outlaws overnight. Pirates of that moment were not just criminals, they were pawns in a geopolitical game. If a captain knew too much about the bargains between empire and outlaw, silencing him, and anyone he carried, would serve more than justice. It would protect reputations, treaties, and the fragile illusion of control. Some scholars argue this disappearance was not a crime of opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated purge, disguised as a mystery. Imagine the prisoners on their final night. Shackled, bruised, exhausted from days at sea, expecting trial at dawn. The air thick with brine and rot, the boards creaking under their restless weight. Then silence, broken not by cannon or cutlass, but by something stranger. Did they feel the ship lurch as if dragged by an unseen current? Did they hear footsteps above, too many for the crew that remained? Did they realize, too late, that they were not being taken to port, but somewhere far darker? Their voices, if they screamed, were swallowed by the night wind. The coast, so close, offered no sanctuary. And by morning, there was no trace of their fear, no echo of their fate. That absence haunts more than a single story. It points to a broader truth about how history handles the inconvenient. Records are not neutral. They are curated silences, deliberate gaps. To understand the vanishing of the pirate captain and his prisoners is to understand the machinery of forgetting, the way power ensures certain questions are never asked. And yet, the Carolina coast has a memory longer than the archives. Local lore, whispered from one generation to the next, insists that sometimes, on fog-choked nights, you can still hear the voices of the 42, carried across the waves. Not a chorus of rage, but a low, continuous murmur, like men trying to explain something they are forbidden to say. The darkness of this case lies not only in what was lost, but in how perfectly it was hidden. 42 men erased, one captain erased, and behind them, perhaps, a truth so volatile it could not be allowed to surface. To investigate is to court unease, because the mystery resists resolution. Was it the sea, the empire, or something older? Still, every possibility is more disturbing than the last. And so the story endures, not as a solved crime, but as a reminder. Disappearance is the oldest weapon of power, and silence is its sharpest blade. The archives of the Carolinas in 1714 are a strange blend of precision and absence. Ship manifests carefully record cargoes of rice, indigo, and human beings brought in chains, yet when it comes to the disappearance of the pirate captain and his 42 prisoners, the paper trail collapses into a silence so deliberate it almost screams. A trial that was meant to convene in Charlestown vanished from the docket without explanation. Depositions that should have been filed by naval officers who arrested the men never appear in the ledger. Even letters from governors and magistrates to the Crown stumble when reaching the subject, offering vague references to an unfortunate incident or a loss at sea, as though words themselves had been instructed to avert their gaze. Such omissions suggest not just neglect but an intentional purge. Something about this case was not to be remembered, yet whispers survived. A diary kept by a young minister in the Carolinas describes his parishioners murmuring about a captain of no nation whose prisoners were swallowed by the tide of night. Another, found in a plantation ledger decades later, records a planter grumbling that the Crown let slip 42 villains who might have testified against their betters. Here, the implication is sharper. These were not random men, plucked from ships, but individuals who carried knowledge dangerous to colonial elites. To make them disappear was not a failure of justice, but a preservation of order. The pirate captain, in this reading, was a tool, expendable, useful only until the moment he and his human cargo had to vanish together. But history rarely cooperates with neat conspiracies. There are other possibilities, each darker than the last. Among sailors, stories spread of a phantom fleet sighted off the Carolina coast. Lanterns glowed where no ships should have been, moving silently, cutting through fog without sound of oars or canvas. Some believed the captain was taken by this fleet, not sunk, but escorted into another world beneath the waves. A French merchant, passing through the same waters weeks later, swore he saw timbers unmarked by decay, floating as if preserved by sorcery, though he could not retrieve them. Colonial records, of course, make no mention of this. They reduce the entire episode to bureaucratic dust. Yet folklore preserves the imagery. 42 voices, shackled, taken alive into the fog. Their cries swallowed, but never extinguished. What makes the disappearance more sinister is its timing. The War of the Spanish Succession had just ended. In 1713, leaving hundreds of privateers stranded, men who had once carried letters of marque for European crowns, but were now branded outlaws. They knew the secrets of naval routes, the vulnerabilities of colonial ports, the hidden coves where stolen wealth could be buried. To governments eager to reassert control, these men were a liability. A pirate captain with 42 prisoners may not have been a criminal at all, but a loose end tied too clumsily. Perhaps he held evidence that Britain still trafficked with men it now labeled pirates. Perhaps the prisoners were witnesses to these transactions. If brought to trial, they might have exposed truths the empire could not afford. In that light, their disappearance looks less like a storm and more like a verdict handed down in silence. Still, not every theory rests in politics. Some residents of the Carolina coast believed the sea itself intervened. To them, the waters were alive with old spirits, African, indigenous, even remnants of drowned sailors who never found shore. Folktales collected much later speak of a hollow tide, a current that opens once every generation, dragging vessels into an unseen abyss where time itself ceases. Elders in fishing villages claimed that when the hollow tide took men, their voices could still be heard on certain nights, calling from beneath the waves, neither dead nor living. It is easy to dismiss such lore as superstition, yet it bears unsettling parallels to the event of 1714. 42 men and their keeper, gone not in storm or battle, but in silence. Precisely the signature of a hollow tide. And what of the captain himself? Some accounts describe him as an impostor, a man who assumed the name of a better-known pirate in order to move freely through waters where fear alone was currency. If true, then his vanishing becomes even more uncanny. For how can history trace a man who never truly existed? Perhaps that was the point, to create a mask, fill it with stories of cruelty and command, and then dissolve it at the right moment. A mask can disappear without consequence. The 42 bound to him, however, were flesh and blood, and their erasure required far more effort. Contemporary historians trying to reconstruct the event find themselves staring at deliberate gaps. It is not merely that records are lost, it is that they end too cleanly, like a candle snuffed out rather than left to burn. In this absence, speculation becomes the only path forward. Did colonial officials arrange for the prisoners' quiet disposal at sea, their chains dragging them down to ensure no body would float back? Did they bribe the captain with promises of pardon, only to betray him once his purpose was served? Or was he himself an agent of that betrayal, steering his captives into the unknown willingly, complicit in their erasure? Each theory reveals more about the fears of the age than about the event itself. Fear of exposure, fear of the sea's unpredictable power, fear of voices that might undo the fragile narrative of empire. What chills the most is how perfectly the silence holds. Unlike other pirate legends, no ballads emerged to immortalize the men. No tavern songs celebrated their daring or cursed their fate. They simply ceased to exist in story, as though their very memory had been outlawed. To erase a life is one crime. To erase even the memory of life is something greater, a theft of existence itself. The Carolina coast became a graveyard not just of men, but of their names. Even now, local fishermen whisper that when the fog drapes low and the tide slackens, one can hear iron striking iron out beyond the breakers. Some say it is just the echo of chains dragged by the current. Others swear it is the sound of prisoners still shackled in the deep, tapping against eternity, waiting for a truth no one dares speak. The sea holds them, the silence guards them, and the empire, perhaps knowingly, let them go. Whatever happened, on that coast in 1714, it was not an accident. It was an act of disappearance so absolute that 3 centuries later, we still feel its shadow pressing against history's fragile walls. On the Carolina coast, time moves differently in the stories told by those who still remember the disappearance. Centuries may have passed, yet the whispers remain, carried across marshes and salt air, as if the land itself refuses to let the silence sit unchallenged. Keynote 7, The Haunting Aftermath, emerges not from official reports, for those are barren, but from the memories, fears, and folklore of ordinary people who lived with the weight of absence. In taverns, long after lamps were extinguished, old sailors would lower their voices and recall the year when 42 prisoners and a pirate captain slipped into nothingness. They would speak not in certainty, but in fragments, as if recounting a dream they themselves doubted. What bound all their stories together was the sense of unease, that something had been stolen from the world, not only lives, but the right to know what became of them. Children along the coast were warned not to wander the dunes at night, for the prisoners were said to roam there still, bound in ghostly irons, searching for the trial they never received. Mothers whispered that if you heard voices at dusk calling your name from the surf, you must not answer, because those voices were not of the living. Some claimed they were lures, an echo designed to draw the curious into the same void that swallowed the men in 1714. Sailors passed along darker variations, suggesting that the missing prisoners had become something else entirely, guardians of the tide, forced to drag others down in exchange for their own suffering to end. Whether believed or not, the persistence of these tales is evidence of a scar, the kind history cannot hide beneath ledgers and silence. It is telling that the most enduring detail in folklore is not the captain, but the 42. Their number is repeated like a curse, precise and immovable, as if the mind clings to it in defiance of erasure. Numbers can anchor memory where names are stolen. Even when no songs recorded their lives, even when no monument marked their deaths, the number itself became the gravestone that could not be burned. And so villagers counted waves at night, marking the 42nd swell as the one most likely to bring shadows ashore. It was not rational, but it was ritual, and rituals survive where facts are denied. What deepens the unease is how this silence shaped identity in the region. Carolina was still young, its settlements fragile, and this event etched into the psychology of its people the knowledge that power could erase without consequence. To live under empire was to know that not all lives were meant to be remembered, and that the sea itself could be a tool in this selective forgetting. This is perhaps the most chilling legacy, the normalization of disappearance, the quiet acceptance that some stories will never be told. For the communities on the margins, the enslaved, the poor, the indentured, this was not an anomaly. It was confirmation of a truth they already lived. Travelers who arrived decades later found that the story of the vanishing was always told in hushed tones, never openly. They noted the nervous glances people gave the horizon when fog rolled in, as if the sea might repeat its theft at any moment. Some claimed entire ships avoided the stretch of coast where the event was said to have occurred, preferring longer routes than to tempt whatever force had claimed the captain and his prisoners. Insurance records even hint at higher premiums charged to vessels that passed too close to the site, though no official acknowledgement tied this to the 1714 disappearance. Here, silence becomes a currency, trading fear for control, and the echoes of the lost men shaped decisions long after their bodies were gone. Over time, writers seeking to romanticize the golden age of piracy stumbled upon this fragment of history. Yet even they struggled to embellish it, for the disappearance contained no heroics, no battles, no treasure. It was too stark, too unresolved. Instead, it became a ghost story, folded into the larger myth of pirates as creatures of both sea and shadow. In some versions, the captain himself was cursed, forced to return every 7 years to the coast, searching for his prisoners, but finding only restless waves. The line between legend and reality blurred, and perhaps that blurring was itself part of the design. When truth is unbearable, myth becomes the shield dot. And yet, modern eyes see something different. The very absence of evidence becomes evidence of suppression. To erase so thoroughly, someone had to care deeply about what might have been revealed. Why strike a trial from the record unless the testimony threatened powerful names? Why remove correspondence from archives unless the story endangered the narrative of empire? The haunting aftermath, then, is not just ghost lights on the sea or whispers in the marsh. It is the realization that history itself can be engineered to protect the guilty. That lesson lingers, shaping how we approach every gap in the record, every silence that feels too clean. In local lore, the prisoners never rest. The sea is said to grow colder where they vanished, the water heavy, as though bearing weight no current can lift. Divers centuries later reported compasses spinning near the site, though officials dismissed such accounts as error. But folklore insists on patterns. Every generation, a stormless night when lanterns are seen on the water, moving against the wind. Some say it is the captain searching for shore, others that it is the prisoners calling for the justice denied them. The detail shifts, but the unease remains constant. This is how memory survives, not in the clarity of documents, but in the persistence of fear. The disappearance on the Carolina coast left behind more than a mystery. It left a void so complete that communities had to fill it with story, with superstition, with ritual. That is the true haunting aftermath, an absence that refuses to stay absent. The 42 cannot be found in graves or records, so they live instead in the imagination, in the dread of the tide, in the chill of fog when it rolls over the marshes. The captain who vanished with them remains a cipher, perhaps real, perhaps invented, but the men he carried into silence remain restless presences. In a world where history often belongs to the victors, their continued existence in story is itself a kind of rebellion. For as long as they are whispered of, they are not entirely gone. Before you leave this story behind, take a moment to consider what it really means. 42 lives, a captain with no clear past, and a silence so deliberate it has lasted for more than 3 centuries. These are not just details from a forgotten page of history. They are reminders of how easily truth can be buried, and how often power decides what we are allowed to remember. The questions you're asking right now, the unease you feel, are exactly the questions the world back then wanted erased. If stories like this one pull you into the shadows of history, if you find yourself needing to know what others tried to hide, then this channel is where you belong. Here we uncover the mysteries that official records left in the dark, and we give voice to those who were silenced. If you haven't already, hit subscribe right now. Join a growing community of people who refuse to accept the official version, who know there is always something more beneath the surface. And when you subscribe, don't forget to turn on the bell, because the next story may be even more unsettling, and you won't want to miss it. I also want to hear from you. What do you think happened on the Carolina coast in 1714? Was it conspiracy, a supernatural force, or something we can't yet explain? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Your voice matters here. Together, let's keep the forgotten alive.